Lena, a 28-year-old woman, staggered into the emergency room, her hands gripping her massive belly. Her face was ghostly pale, drenched in sweat, and her breath came in ragged gasps. "Help me! My baby's coming!" she screamed, her voice raw with desperation. The bustling hospital came to an abrupt halt. Dr. Carter, still in his street clothes, froze mid-step before instincts took over. "Get a stretcher, now!" he barked. Nurse Olivia sprinted forward, pushing a squeaky gurney. But as they rushed to move Lena, a German shepherd lunged, sinking its teeth into the metal frame, snarling fiercely. The tension thickened. Staff exchanged bewildered glances. Then, as Lena let out a guttural howl, the dog responded. What happened next defied reason. Before we dive into the next part, take a moment for yourself. Grab a glass of water, stretch your legs, and settle in. You deserve a little break. And remember, you're not alone. We're here, sharing this story together. Now ready for what happens next? Let's continue. Lena's screams echoed through the hospital as her body convulsed in agony. Dr. Carter and Nurse Olivia pushed the stretcher with all their strength, their hearts pounding. The German shepherd, Bruno, released its grip but didn't move away. It followed, its sharp eyes locked on Lena, its stance protective, determined. Something about the way the dog moved, the way it reacted, sent a chill through the air. Inside the delivery room, chaos unfolded. Lena's body arched off the table, her face contorted in unbearable pain. "It hurts! Oh God, something's wrong!" she gasped between contractions. Dr. Carter snapped on his gloves, sweat dripping down his temples. "Stay with me, Lena. We're going to get through this." But as he examined her, his expression darkened. The amniotic sac had ruptured. The contractions were relentless, but she wasn't fully dilated. It didn't make sense. Her belly seemed impossibly large, her skin stretched to its limit. Outside the room, Bruno stood like a statue, ears pricked, his muscles tense. Nurses whispered, doctors paused. A strange energy crackled in the air. Then it happened. Lena threw her head back and let out a sound, a howl, deep, primal, raw. The hospital staff froze, their blood running cold. A second later, Bruno answered, his own howl reverberating through the halls like a battle cry. The lights flickered. A tray of instruments clattered to the floor. Nurse Olivia gasped, her grip tightening on Lena's hand. "Doctor, what is happening?" Dr. Carter couldn't respond. His focus was locked on Lena, whose pupils had dilated unnaturally wide. Her breath came in short, animalistic pants. Then, with a scream that shook the walls, the first baby was born. The cry that followed was shrill, piercing, almost unnatural. Dr. Carter lifted the newborn and recoiled, his face drained of color. His hands trembled, his knees nearly buckled. The baby had hair, thick, dark, covering its face like a pelt. Nurse Olivia let out a choked gasp. The room spun. Then Lena whispered, her voice hoarse but resolute, "Where's Bruno?" The dog, still waiting just beyond the door, let out a single bark, low, commanding. And in that moment, an unspoken truth settled over the room. Something beyond human was at play. Dr. Carter stood frozen, his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind screamed for logic, for reason, but none of it made sense. The baby in his arms, Lena's baby, was covered in thick, dark hair. Not the soft fuzz of a newborn, but a dense coat, coarse and wild. Its tiny hands curled into fists, fingernails sharper than they should be. The infant wailed, its cry sharp and piercing, sending an eerie shiver through the delivery room. Nurse Olivia took an unsteady step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Doctor?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Dr. Carter couldn't answer. His hands shook, his knees felt weak. Outside, Bruno let out another deep bark, as if he sensed something was wrong, as if he were waiting. Lena, drenched in sweat, forced her heavy eyes open. "Let me see my baby," she rasped. But before anyone could move, another contraction ripped through her. Her body seized, back arching off the bed as a guttural groan tore from her throat. "The second one's coming," Dr. Carter shouted, snapping back into action. He handed the first baby to Nurse Olivia, who clutched it with trembling hands, unable to tear her gaze away from its strange features. Then with urgency, the doctor turned back to Lena. "Push, Lena! You have to push!" she screamed, her fingers clawing at the sheets, her body racked with agony. Bruno, still outside, howled, a deep, mournful sound that sent chills through everyone who heard it. Then, with one final, desperate effort, Lena's body gave in. The second baby slipped into Dr. Carter's waiting hands. Silence. Then, a cry. A normal, human cry. Dr. Carter exhaled sharply, glancing down. This baby, this one was different. No thick hair, no unnatural features, just a perfect, pink-skinned newborn. A wave of relief washed over him, but before he could speak, Lena's weak voice broke through the tense air. "My babies. Let me hold them." Nurse Olivia hesitated, but Dr. Carter nodded. Carefully, she placed both infants into Lena's trembling arms. She looked down at them, her breath catching in her throat. One, normal, fragile. The other, wild, unfamiliar, its dark eyes glinting with something she couldn't name. Outside, Bruno sat motionless, his golden eyes locked on the door, watching, waiting, as if he already knew what no one else could understand. Lena's arms tightened around her newborns as exhaustion threatened to pull her under. Sweat dripped from her brow, her breath ragged, but her grip was firm. She cradled them, her heart pounding against her ribs. One child was soft, pink, fragile, human. The other was something else. Its tiny body was warm, covered in thick fur, its dark eyes unblinking, too aware. It cooed, no, it growled, a low rumbling sound deep in its chest. Dr. Carter swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Nurse Olivia stood beside him, still clutching the metal tray she had nearly dropped. The tension in the air was suffocating. The fluorescent lights flickered. Even the distant hum of hospital machines seemed muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then from the hallway came a sharp click of nails against tile. Bruno, the German shepherd, had been waiting, still and silent, but now he was moving. His head was high, his ears pricked, his golden eyes fixed on the door. He let out a deep, measured bark. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't fear. It was something else entirely. A signal. Lena turned her head toward the sound, her eyes dazed but determined. "Let him in," she whispered. Nurse Olivia hesitated. "Lena, we can't just..." "Let him in," she repeated, her voice sharper now, urgent. Dr. Carter met Olivia's wide-eyed gaze. They had spent years in medicine, in logic, in science, but nothing about this night made sense. With a slow, trembling hand, the nurse reached for the door handle and pulled. Bruno stepped inside. The energy in the room shifted immediately. He walked with purpose, his nails tapping softly against the tile. His eyes never left Lena, not once. When he reached her bedside, he stopped, lowering his massive head. Lena's breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, she lifted the fur-covered child toward him. Bruno sniffed, his nostrils flaring. Then, he licked the baby's forehead. Once, twice. A low whimper escaped his throat, something close to reverence. The baby stilled, its tiny body relaxed against Lena's chest. No one spoke. No one dared move. Dr. Carter clenched his fists, his mind screaming for an explanation. But as Bruno curled up beside Lena's bed, his golden eyes never leaving the newborn, one terrifying truth settled deep in the doctor's chest. This was no ordinary child. And Bruno, he had known it all along. Joel had never believed in fate. He believed in discipline, in control, in the power of the human body to be shaped and molded to perfection. But as he burst through the hospital doors, his heart hammering in his chest, he felt none of that control, only fear. Bruno had come for him. The dog had torn through the streets, barking with urgency, dragging him away from his workout and into something he didn't understand. Now standing in the sterile white hallway, panting from the sprint, he could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing against his skin. A nurse pointed toward the delivery room, her face pale, eyes wide. "She's inside," she whispered. Joel didn't wait. He shoved the door open. The scene inside hit him like a fist to the gut. Lena was lying on the bed, her face damp with sweat, her arms curled protectively around two tiny bundles. Bruno was beside her, sitting so still he might have been carved from stone. And then Joel's gaze fell to the children. His knees nearly gave out. One was perfect, rosy cheeks, tiny fists curled in sleep, the very image of innocence. But the other wasn't right. Dark fur covered its small body. Its fingers twitched in a way that didn't seem natural. Its breath was heavier, deeper, and its eyes, God, its eyes, stared back at him with something Joel couldn't name. His mouth went dry, his throat tightened. "Lena," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. What is this?" Lena lifted her head. "Our child," she said simply, her voice raw but steady. Joel took a step back, his pulse pounding in his ears. "No," he breathed. "That's not possible." Bruno let out a low growl, just loud enough for Joel to hear. The warning was unmistakable. Lena's expression hardened. "Joel, look at me," she said, her voice firmer now. "This is our child. Both of them." Joel's breath came fast and shallow. His world felt like it was tilting, breaking apart. And then, as if sensing his father's fear, the fur-covered baby opened its mouth and let out a soft, unmistakable howl. The sound paralyzed Joel. It wasn't a cry. It wasn't even a whimper. It was a howl, small, fragile, but unmistakable. The kind that sent shivers down the spine. The kind that stirred something primal, something ancient. His legs locked, his stomach twisted, and for a terrifying second, he felt like the walls of the hospital were closing in. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, this can't be." But then he saw Lena, cradling both children, her body trembling, but not with fear, with fierce, unwavering love. Her eyes, glassy with exhaustion, locked onto his. "Joel, please," she whispered. "Don't be afraid." Bruno shifted, his ears flicking forward, watching every move Joel made. The dog wasn't just sitting guard. He was waiting. Joel's hands curled into fists. His heart thundered, his breath ragged. He could handle pressure. He had built his body to withstand strain, to push past pain. But this was something else. He took a step closer, his muscles coiled with tension. "Lena," he said, forcing the words out. "Tell me the truth." Her grip on the babies tightened. "I have," she whispered. "They're ours." Joel's mind spun. The sterile hospital room, the hum of machines, the scent of antiseptic. It all felt surreal, like a dream he couldn't wake up from. He looked at the fur-covered infant, at the way it nestled against its mother's chest, peaceful, content. The tiny creature had his nose, his jawline, and those eyes, God, those eyes were hers. His stomach clenched. He had been taking minoxidil for months. Could it really explain this? Could science? A heavy silence stretched between them. Then Bruno let out a deep, guttural sound, low and commanding. Joel turned toward him, heart hammering. The dog stared at him, unblinking, his golden eyes dark with understanding. And then, Joel didn't know why, didn't know what possessed him. He knelt. Bruno exhaled, a sound almost like approval. Joel reached out with a shaking hand. His fingers brushed against the tiny furred cheek of his child. Warm, real, alive. The baby stirred, and then, slowly, gently, it reached for him. Joel slowly, carefully, scooped the fur-covered baby into his arms. The infant let out a soft, contented sound, curling against his chest. Warm, trusting. Bruno watched, his tail thumping once against the floor. Silent approval. Joel swallowed hard and pressed a trembling kiss to his son's forehead. It didn't matter what the world would think. It didn't matter what was normal. This was his family, and he would love them, protect them, no matter what. Bruno, the loyal dog, carries a meaningful message as well. Sometimes the things we see as small or insignificant turn out to be our greatest source of strength. While Joel struggled with doubt, Bruno already knew. The dog did not need explanations or science. He understood one simple truth. Family is family, no matter how different it may appear. Ultimately, this story teaches us about acceptance and connection. At any stage of life, we may encounter things we never expected, but instead of reacting with fear, we should choose love. Because sometimes the true miracle is not in understanding everything. It is in the ability to love even when we don't.